But yeah, I'm Stuart, and I'm going to be doing a talk, Web Accessibility 101. So we're going to have a look at, just quickly run over the basic components of a website, what web accessibility actually means, how to know if your website is accessible, a little bit on disability on the web, and then finally, how an accessible website benefits you as a developer and as a business. It's just a little about me. So I'm a self-taught developer. I've been doing this for about 6 years, bunch of different kind of roles. I currently work at Study as the front-end engineer. We help students to study abroad. And I class myself as an accessibility advocate. So I'm really interested in coding, being a better developer in terms of accessibility, also right through the business at Study. I'm trying to promote us to be more accessible. And I kind of got into this, so I'm dyslexic myself. So I grew up like right there. And yeah, so I used to talk a bit backwards. I'm not very good at writing, so if it wasn't for computers, I think I'd be pretty screwed. And then when I was at uni, I started working fractional hearing loss as a care worker. So I worked in a care home with deaf adults with learning difficulties. And through that, I got a bit interested in the deaf community. And then I chose to write my dissertation about how deaf people in Britain experience music. Over the course of traveling around the country, I got to meet a whole bunch of different deaf people, some that were involved in the deaf community, some that just had hearing impairments. And it really was an experience where I got to see how some people had real barriers and things that I just took for granted, such as keeping in touch with my friends on the phone or just ordering a drink in a loud bar, but also how technology was helping to break down those barriers. Yeah, so that's kind of why I'm interested in it. So what do we reckon a website is in its most basic form? Anybody got any ideas? Text, I like it. Any others? These are both real good. I mean, it's definitely not this. It is just a text document. So here we've got a screenshot of one of the earliest websites. We've got a heading at the top, a couple of paragraphs, a list, and a whole load of links. So I'll just quickly scan over this section. For me, there's 3 basic elements that make up a website. We've got HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And if we think of these as Batman, HTML would be a skeleton. So it's a structure and the content. We've got specific elements, these specific jobs, a paragraph element for a paragraph, different header elements for different types of heading. And the order of this is really important. So if you had a book, and on the front cover was the title for the first chapter, where the title for the first chapter was the title of the book, it wouldn't make any sense. Exactly the same for HTML. When it comes to CSS, this is the presentation layer, what's making this bit of text this color of black and that font size. And if you've done your HTML right, if for some reason your CSS breaks, then your website should still be usable. And finally, we've got JavaScript, carrying out all the actions, making your site interactive. And this is often where accessibility can fall down. Just because you can make something interactive doesn't mean you should. But also JavaScript is essential for making a website completely accessible. And without CSS and JavaScript working, a website should function. So while it wouldn't be the same experience, users still need to be able to carry out the core functionality. So here we've got a screenshot of the Study homepage with CSS and JavaScript working. And here's with JavaScript off, so if heaven forbid I write something terrible and everything breaks, someone's got a really aggressive ad blocker, they can still access our menu here. It doesn't look pretty, but it's functional. And again, no CSS, no JavaScript, but we've still got hopefully what looks like a menu and some really basic links. So just on the basics, final thing, this numeron, A11Y. So we have the A at the beginning, 11 letters and the Y, sometimes referred to as Ali. The irony being that if it's not explained, I don't think you'd be able to work out what it is. But on the flip side, I can't spell accessibility, but I can remember A11Y. Sweet. Any questions on those? Cool. All right, moving on. So what does web accessibility actually mean? There's a whole load of really complicated dictionary definitions, but for me, it's just making sure that anybody can access your website, irrelevant of what device they're using, how fast their connection is, what language they speak, a permanent, temporary, or socio-economic disability. As Tim Berners-Lee said, the power of the web is in its universality. Access by everyone, regardless of their disability, is an essential aspect of it. So how do you know if your website's accessible? Well, with some guidelines. So the World Wide Web Consortium, W3C, created these, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, sometimes referred to as a WCAG. And they're broken down into 4 principles. So these are kind of the overarching categories. Inside those are 13 guidelines. So these are basic goals that we're trying to achieve. Things like text alternatives, time-based media, and navigatable. Inside each of the guidelines, there's a bunch of success criterion. So these are specific testable objectives, such as use of color and audio controls. And each criterion has a level of compliance. The level of compliance depends on how difficult it is to implement and how essential it is to access the content. So we'll have a look at each of these in a sec. So, starting with the principles. We've got perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So when it comes to perceivable, it's defined as the information and user interface components must be presentable to users in ways which they can perceive. So we'll have a look at the study site and the mobile menu specifically for each of the different categories. So for me as a sighted user, if I looked at the site on a small device like my phone, I can see that this little icon on the right, the burger icon, I'm presuming this is going to open a menu. But because I can see, I can perceive that that's there. But what happens if the website was written out to you? Or if you had, if a website was read out to you, how would you perceive that the menu is there? Depending how you'd code it. So for us, the button would only be there if JavaScript's working. If someone was having a site read out to them, when they came to focus on there, it would read out the name of the element, so button, and then it would read out menu here. So our designer didn't want the bit of text there because he felt it cluttered up the interface, but for someone having a site read out to them, hopefully that's enough context for them to perceive what that little element's going to do. When it comes to operable, user interface components and navigation must be operable. So this is kind of about how you interact with the site. So for me, if I'm using the site on my phone, probably going to use my thumb to open a mobile menu, but that's because I've got full use of my hands. But what about if I was using the mobile site with a keyboard? Because we've used a button, we could tab along to it and use the space or the enter key, and that would open up the menu. But if we hadn't used the right bit of HTML, this might not be operable, so then a user couldn't open up the menu. So understandable is defined as information and the operation of user interfaces must be understandable. So when I see the burger icon, you're going to presume it's going to open up the menu. But if it opened up, say, I don't know, a sign-up form for the newsletter, that will be really confusing. I'm not a massive fan of my example, but I thought a better one was these, Norman doors. So hands up on the right, who thinks this is a pull? Pull? Pull handle? All right, what about push? It's a push. They did it the wrong way around. If you ever come up to one of these doors and you go to push it or pull in, it's wrong. It's really confusing. This is more, I feel, what understandable is trying to get at. And finally, with robust. So content must be robust enough that can be interpreted reliably by a wide variety of user agents, including assistive technologies. For me, this really also is about performance. So let's say that we've done a terrible job of coding the site, it's super slow, someone's on a really old Android phone on a really poor data connection, there might be a chance that they can't open the menu, or if they do, it lags. So they'll touch it, nothing happens, they'll touch it again, it'll close. So you've got to make sure that your sites are robust enough to withstand not just me using it on a fancy MacBook Pro on a gigabit data line. By focusing on the principles and not the technologies, we emphasize the need to think about the different ways that people interact with the content. The guidelines are great, but they're not there as a box ticking exercise. If you were there just doing some programmatic test and it said it was accessible, that doesn't necessarily mean your site is actually accessible. It's really important to make sure you test with a wide variety of different users. So one of the things we came up against studies, so before I joined, we'd gone with this super bright orange, which presents a bunch of problems if you're trying to put text over the top. So if you had a color contrast text, this white, I think 18 pixels, comes out a score as 3.01, which fails accessibility for the basic level we're trying to achieve. Whereas the black comes out at just over 5. But when we tested it with users and doing some research about this kind of shade of orange, most people would say that the white text is actually easier to see. So while it failed the programmatic test, when we tested with other users and did some research, we felt that this was the better option. So that's where I feel you've just got to use common sense and not just stick to the guidelines. So we looked at the principles there. We'll have a look at the compliance that I mentioned earlier. So the higher the level, the more restraints it will put on your design. Single A, they'll say, will have some impact. Double A will have medium impact. And triple A, high to extreme. Now, when it's saying high to extreme, it's more referring to the difficulty to implement rather than the fact you're going to have just a black and white website. You really want to be aiming for AA compliance. I don't know how the legislation affects us, but in the end of last year in the EU, if you were working with a public body, you have to have at least AA compliance. There's similar legislation in the US. And to be honest, just to make sure you're delivering a robust experience, AA is what you need to be aiming for. So how do you know if your website is accessible? So I thought we'd go through an example, going through a few of the success criterions. So let's say we want to make a video for the Bristol JS meetup. It's a 1-minute animated video with a plinky plonky kind of soundtrack. But how do we make sure that's accessible to a wide variety of users? So the first thing we have to do is make sure there's an audio description or media alternative. So this would be really easy for us to do. Let's say we've got a script writer in, they've written the script for 1 minute, we already have that in a Google Doc. All we now need to do is put that somewhere else on the page. So for instance, if someone can't view the site because it can't load, or because of a physical disability, they can't access the content, they can still know what we're trying to explain to them in the video. So by doing that, we've got single A compliance. So next, we have adding some captions. So a few years ago, this might have been quite a difficult job, to make sure you've got all the script right, it comes in at the right timing, but we're putting our video up on YouTube. They've got some functionality that they'll help you auto-sync it up and you can trim it around. So really quickly, we can take the script, put it onto YouTube, turn it into some captions. Boom, we're AA compliant. Now, while this is great for someone with a hearing impairment, if you're, say, trying to view the video in the office and you don't want to play it, but you want to know what's going on, and captions might come up on Twitter. Therefore, we're helping sighted users that have hearing be able to access our content if for some reason they're choosing not to play the audio. I'll leave audio description, but we'll look at sign language. So there's over 300 different sign languages in the world. So in Britain, we have BSL. In America, they've got ASL, and they're completely different. So we use a two-handed alphabet. So this would be A in British Sign Language, but in American Sign Language, this would be A. So you can see there, if we were trying to have 300 different sign language interpreters on our site, that would be expensive and would be really difficult to do. How would someone choose which of the 300 they want? So I would say maybe you could argue there, that's something where you wouldn't implement AAA. But with the Bristol JavaScript meetup, therefore it would be reasonable to say we just need British Sign Language interpreter on there. We could find there's a couple of charities locally where someone would come down, quickly do the interpreting for us, and there we've got a AAA video. So hopefully that's a kind of quick, rough example of how these would actually apply to a real use case. So let's have a look at disability on the web. Anybody got a guess at what percentage of UK identifies as being disabled? 20? Anybody else?
28.
28. Pretty close between a lot of them. 21.5% of UK identifies as being disabled. So if your website was not accessible, that's like saying that the whole population of London and the entire population of Scotland cannot access your site. In reality, I imagine it's much higher. That's just done on the census about people that identify as being disabled. So someone, say, in the back end of Yorkshire who's got a terrible data connection wouldn't classify as disabled, but if your site's not optimized, they cannot access your content. And this stat's pretty similar around the world. So in the US, it's a bit over 19. In New Zealand, it's just a touch over 23, so it's a pretty good average. And in Britain, if you're disabled, on average, life's going to cost you £583 more every month. So I think the least we can do is try and make our websites accessible to ease that burden. So when we're talking about the web, W3C have got 5 main categories. They are seeing, hearing, speaking, moving, and thinking. And we'll have a look at each of those now. And when it comes to those disabilities, they're put into 4 different categories. So we've got permanent, temporary, situational, and socioeconomic. So permanent's pretty self-explanatory, but temporary, so like our kitty here's got a cone on for a couple of weeks, therefore they're not going to be able to hear properly, and what they can hear is going to sound a bit weird. The same if, say, you had an ear infection for a few weeks. Therefore, you can't hear the video properly, so the subtitles we created earlier are going to make our video easier to access. When it comes to the situational, if you're sitting in a coffee shop and you're trying to have a video call, what happens to myself quite a bit, it's impossible to hear someone because the machine's blasting away your ear. But if you can have some subtitles come up on your video call, you can still participate fully in the conversation. And when it comes to the last one, I'd say, for me, this is about users are going to be on poor device and poor data connections. So, we'll have a look at seeing. So the first video I've got here is of me having a quick rummage around on the study website. I'm using the screen reader voiceover by Mac, and it's been used on Safari. So most screen readers, the technology that can literally read out a screen, they pair best with a particular browser. Worth noting, I'm not a screen reader user, so how I'm interacting with a site is probably completely different how a native screen reader user would be doing. I also messed up the video, so the first bit you can't see the top, but you should be able to hear.
VoiceOver on Safari. In Studi. Study abroad. Visited. Link. Main navigation. Net. Link. About. Show submenu for about. Show submenu for about. Expanded. But link. Our store. Link. 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 Show submenu for about. Show submenu for about. Collapse. Heading level 1. Discover the perfect university for you. Heading level 2. How Studi can help you. Heading level 3. Heading level 2. 2 items. We match students with universities all over the world. Link. Find a program. You are.
Cool. So, bit of a rough example, but firstly, I was just going along a bunch of interactive elements, and then secondly, I was moving along by heading. So that's the most common way on the last year's screen reader server that screen reader users will use your site. So they'll navigate the page going down different headings. Okay. So next up, we've got a Braille reader. I don't know a whole load about these, but I think the video will do a better job of explaining it than me.
So now navigate to your chat box and type out your message. When your friend replies, you can also read his message on Braille. BrailleMe is also designed to work with your computers via USB. With the help of a screen reading software like NVDA or VoiceOver, you can control your computer from BrailleMe. Even in complex applications like Word, you can use BrailleMe to accurately create documents. For professional.
Cool. So that's just a quick video about one way somebody with a visual impairment might be accessing your site. On to hearing. So this is a video of Google Meet, which is Google's video calling app. On there, they now have some live captions. I kind of touched on it earlier. So as you're speaking, they'll create captions for you. This video is a guy from Australia called Michael Lowry, who's very much into captions and transcripts, and it's him just testing out the feature.
Good morning. My name is Michael, and I'm just quickly testing out the new live captioning feature that is available on Google Hangouts right now. Perfect.
So as you can see, he did a pretty good job of picking up what he was saying. So when it comes to speaking, I feel an example I could come up with was on the studies site with a chatbot. So often we're speaking to students maybe from Pakistan or Nigeria, where English is a second language and very much to a varying degree of ability. So the way the business used to work is you would somehow get in touch with us, and then we have a call center in Ecuador, and they would give the potential students a ring. A whole bunch of problems with this, time zones being one of them, but English being another one. Where with a chatbot, the students very much can get in touch whenever they want. The advice center is running 24 hours a day now. But also by having a chatbot, they can do it in their own time. They don't have to feel pressured the same way as they're doing a video call, but by it being text, they can make use of translation services that they wouldn't be able to use if it's a video call. And I think it also is great for other people. Personally, I'd probably prefer a chatbot to communicate with. So you're opening up your site, if you use something like that, to a whole bunch of different users. Next, we have motor control. So there's a whole different array of devices that different people with various disabilities can use. The one here I've got is a mouse stick. So this person is controlling their tablet using a mouse stick. So finally, we've got thinking. So animations and transitions can be really helpful for guiding users around our interfaces, but for some people that can be really hurtful, such as people with vestibular disorders, sometimes a migraine and seizures. These animations can trigger a lot of hurt. So one simple thing we can do is give them the option to turn it off. So in your browser, you can set to reduce motion, and then with this little bit of CSS, you could then disable all your animations and transitions. Dyslexia is the most common learning disability in the UK, and one of the easiest ways you can help dyslexic people is keeping your line length down. So you want to have the line of text here while being terrible to read because it's over an image. It's also super long. So if it's a dyslexic person to try follow the text over there, the chances are that they could easily be, like often I jump down a line before I've got to the end of it. Whereas you see BBC here, Nice short line length, so it's much easier to digest, but it's the same for any user, because often our displays are flashing at us. It's difficult to concentrate if you have a long line length. But it's more than just interfaces. It's all about performance, SEO, and content. So finally, how does an accessible website benefit you? So there's lots of different benefits to your business. First up, good accessibility is often good SEO. As we touched on earlier with the transcript, Google's not going to wait around to crawl a video, but if you have the transcript of video there, they'll know what's going on your page. The same when it comes to alt text and lots of other different aspects of accessibility. It's good for your corporate social responsibility and your ethics, I feel. If you're a company that's promoting the fact you're making your website accessible, that's surely going to have benefits for you. More potential customers means more potential revenue. If you ignore London and Scotland, that's a lot of potential customers in the UK. Minimising your legal risk, so it is a legal requirement in the UK for your website to be accessible. We have the Disabilities Discrimination Act of 95 and more recently the Equalities Act of 2010. And Section 20 of that states that service providers specifically have a duty to make adjustments for disabled persons, whether they are an online service or a brick and mortar establishment. Now in the UK, I am not particularly aware of any lawsuits, but I do know that RNIB, the National Buying Charity, have contacted some large companies and said, look, your site's inaccessible, here's your problems, you need to fix it because it's a legal requirement. But over in the USA, last year, Domino's, you might have come across, were in trouble. So a blind man who was using a screen reader to order his pizza couldn't order his pizza because they hadn't developed their website properly. He took them to court. It went all the way up to Supreme Court because Domino's felt that the Americans with Disabilities Act didn't cover their website. The Supreme Court firmly disagreed, and that's currently been settled outside court. This has increased a lot, known as drive-by lawsuits in the UK, where someone comes to the site, it's inaccessible, and they're trying to sue them. In 2018, it increased 277% in the US, and I presume at some point that will come over to the UK as well. This is a really great article. It's quite old, from a list apart. There's a link here and at the end of the slides to some resources to it, but it does a good job of just going over the main points when it comes to law in the UK. So here's some simple things you can do to ensure that your website's accessible. When it comes to type, make sure you're using a sensible font size, don't go too small or super big, and make sure the spacing between your lines is logical. When it comes to colours, make sure that your text is easy to read. Content is often really overlooked. If you've got really complex language in there, that's going to be difficult for someone with dyslexia, but maybe someone with English as a second language or someone that was having the page translated for them, it's going to be much harder for that to work. With links, you need to make sure that your interactive style is consistent. Once the users learn, okay, this thing is a link, they can apply that learning across your site. And also the text you've got in a link. Just having read more is not sufficient on its own. The link text should tell the user exactly where they're going to go or what they're going to do. When it comes to images, the simplest way probably you can make your website more performance is just make sure that you compress your images and serve them up at the right size. If it only needs to be 300 pixels wide, don't have an image that's 2,000 pixels wide. And with forms, make sure that the labels are always visible and are really clear, and use a correct form element for the correct type of question. So for me, I use this little JavaScript bookmarklet to check my sites. It's super fast. You just click it from your bookmarks bar and it pops up. So you've got all the different kind of things you can check. One of the things I really like here, for your headings, you get an outline. And then next to each heading, you get a little box. Maybe you can see on the top left of the D of Discover. So it tells you what the heading type is. It gives you a green box if you're using the correct heading. If you're using the incorrect heading, it'll pop up red. But yeah, this is a really great tool. So I've got a few resources here on these slides. The one I'd like to point out specifically is don't use Google Lighthouse to audit your site. Somebody here wrote an article where they built something that was getting a 100% accessibility score with Lighthouse, but it completely bombed. It's really not a great tool for accessibility. So in summary, an accessible website isn't just about disabled users. Think about if you fell off your bike tomorrow, you broke your mouse hand, how are you going to interact with a website? An accessible site's going to open you up to more users, so therefore you can make more money. Good content is really critical. Obviously, I'm sure most of us could write some content, but doesn't necessarily mean we should. A copywriter will go a long way to making an accessible website. It is a legal requirement here in the UK. And automatic testing should only ever be a guideline. make sure you test with users as much as possible. Even if that's just different colleagues, your mom, get out there and test with some different users. And as Leonie Watson said, web accessibility isn't about being perfect, just about being a little bit better than yesterday. Cool, thanks for listening.
Do you have any general guidelines for line height and text size, and especially when that comes to mobile apps?
Yeah, I think the line height, I mean, it would depend on the type of text. So if it's a heading or if it's a paragraph. Off the top of my head, I think it's 1.5 for line height. But I've got a couple of links I could send you rather than me trying to bullshit my way through it. Sorry, what was your other question? Line height and
Text size.
Text size.
Especially for mobile apps, because often people are looking on very small screens.
Yeah, once again, I have a couple of numbers in my head, but I'll check something and come back to you after if that's okay, just so I don't lie. Sweet.
You put up a page that had a bunch of links and resources. Can
Yes.
you make those available?
Yeah, I'll share the slides afterwards, and everything apart from one video should be accessible.
You said that sites should be available even if JavaScript's disabled.
Yes.
And you justified it by saying that the JavaScript might be broken on your site.
Yes.
If I have monitoring in place to detect that, does that not apply, or are there other reasons to?
If you have monitoring, what?
To detect that if the JavaScript's broken.
Okay, so I guess then you would know, but at that very moment in time, your users still would have a problem. Is that correct?
Yeah, but if I have a support team that would consider that the site being down.
Sure, yeah, I guess I would say, I mean, that's a fair argument. I mean, I would also say with ad blockers, so for instance, recently I was trying to order some medicine for my kitten. My ad blocker was breaking some JavaScript on this site, therefore I couldn't order meds for my kitten. It's very frustrating. But just for me as a principle, I would say JavaScript is a progressive enhancement, and it's not essential for the websites I make. That's kind of the methodology I go down. Ideally, yeah, definitely having a support team to help you. But for me, core functionality should be accessible without JavaScript. Cool. Does that answer your question? Cool. Thanks. Sorry.
Earlier, when you had the menu with the label, I noticed you had the label in a span. Would you usually use that technique rather than doing an ARIA label within?
Sure. So ARIA, I would use as a second resort. There's a really good article I didn't link to by someone called Sarah Higley, where she says like teach your kids about ARIA. But the point is that ARIA is great. But if there's something else you can use, it's better to. The reason being that screen readers are notoriously difficult to support. Or maybe like, what was it, 5 or 6 years ago to try to do cross-browser support. A good example which there was a property for ARIA controls. So basically, this button, you give it an ID of something it controls. That support has completely been dropped, which is irritating because it would be really useful. So I would try use something else before using that. Ideally for me, I would have the word menu there. So like my grand's 92 and we got an iPad at Christmas. She's no idea what the burger icon does, but if she could see it, she'd be fine. Yeah, does that help? Yeah. Cool. Go for it, sorry.
In the time you've been developing, have you seen any change in how ready people are to invest time and money into making things accessible? Have you seen attitudes change in the time you've been working, or has it stayed the same? Or
Have I seen a change? Yeah, I think it does, but I think it depends how you do it. So I've had problems before at agencies specifically where clients don't necessarily see the value. You can tell them it's a legal problem, but because I can't say, oh, look, this company was sued, like in here, it wasn't Domino's in the UK that was sued, they're not going to care. I guess the best example is when I came into study, I was really given the opportunity to say, look, here's our accessibility is good. I did a bit of a presentation at the company, and then as soon as I got the slide up about the 21% of the UK, the CEO was like, yeah, this is amazing. Why have we never come across this before? So I think it's really about trying to get the ground up and explain to the whole company why it's important. But then I do feel a bit like with the JavaScript question earlier, if you've got your HTML right, that is most of your accessibility problems done. And if you do your JavaScript right, again, like if you're making a div interactive, it's the wrong thing to do. So I think it all comes down to good programming principles.
Thank you.
Cool. Sorry, back.
In one of the videos, you showed the user tabbing through the headings.
Yes.
Is that something that's built into the browser, or something that we have to do as developers? And we have to...
So that's for screen reader. So one of the ways you can navigate with a screen reader is going by headings. And that, when there's a screen reader survey done every year by, I think it's by W3C. Again, I'll share a link to it, but it's this really interesting survey. And the most common way that a screen reader user would navigate the site is by literally, rather than at the beginning I went by the links, they would go down by the headings. So you go from H1 to all the H2s. If you like H2, you then go inside it again. So that's why getting your headings right is so important, and making sure the heading actually describes the content that's there. So yeah, cool. All right, I'll stop there. But yeah, thanks everybody. Thank you.